More than 5,000 years ago, long before the pyramids of Egypt, before the rise of Rome, and long before modern civilization had even begun to take shape, something extraordinary was happening on the windswept plains of ancient Britain. Human beings were moving stones that weighed several tons. They were dragging them across enormous distances. They were shaping them, raising them, and somehow positioning them into a massive stone monument that would survive for thousands of years. Today, we call it Stonehenge. But standing among these ancient stones, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why did they build it? Was Stonehenge an ancient temple? A sacred burial ground? A giant astronomical calendar designed to follow the movement of the sun? Or was it something far more important to the people who built it? Because the mystery goes deeper. Some of the stones used at Stonehenge did not come from the land around it. They came from places hundreds of miles away. Think about that for a moment. No trucks, no cranes, no modern roads, no steel machinery. And yet, somehow, these enormous stones traveled across an ancient landscape and eventually arrived here. Who organized such an enormous undertaking? How many people were involved? What did they know that we have forgotten? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what happened here thousands of years ago that was important enough for generations of people to keep returning to this place? For centuries, Stonehenge has inspired legends of giants, magic, ancient kings, and mysterious powers. In the modern age, some have even suggested something far more extraordinary, that perhaps humans were not alone. There is no scientific evidence that extraterrestrials built Stonehenge, but there is something equally fascinating. The more archaeologists discover about this ancient monument, the more complicated the mystery becomes, because Stonehenge was not simply a circle of stones. It was part of a much larger prehistoric landscape, a place where people gathered, a place where the dead were buried, a place seemingly connected to the movements of the sun, and a place that required an extraordinary amount of human effort, generation after generation. The people who built Stonehenge are gone. Their language is gone. Their stories are gone. But their stones remain, silent, massive, and strangely precise. So tonight, we're going back more than 5,000 years to a world where Stonehenge was not an ancient ruin, but a living mystery. Who built Stonehenge? How did they do it? And most importantly, what were they trying to tell us? Imagine standing on the Salisbury Plain more than 5,000 years ago. There are no roads stretching toward distant cities, no machines cutting through the landscape, no steel cranes, no engines, no trucks carrying enormous loads. Instead, there are open grasslands, scattered forests, small settlements, wild animals, and groups of prehistoric people living in a world that would be almost impossible for us to recognize today. And somewhere on this ancient landscape, a decision was being made that would change the region forever. People were going to build something enormous, something that would require generations of labor, something that would still be standing thousands of years later. We know it today as Stonehenge, but the first mistake is to imagine that Stonehenge suddenly appeared as the stone circle we see today. It did not. Stonehenge was not a single construction project completed by one group of people. It was a monument that evolved over centuries, perhaps even longer, as different generations returned to the same landscape and transformed it again and again. Long before the famous stones were standing upright, the area already held enormous ceremonial earthworks. Ditches were dug into the ground, banks were raised, pits were created, burials took place. The landscape itself was being changed, and that raises our first major question. Why this place? Why did prehistoric communities repeatedly return to this particular stretch of southern Britain? To understand the scale of what happened here, we have to forget everything we know about modern construction. Today, if someone wants to move a 20-ton object, they can call a specialized transport company. Engineers can calculate the load. Hydraulic machines can lift it. Trucks can carry it. Cranes can place it precisely into position. A prehistoric builder had none of those advantages. Yet the people responsible for Stonehenge somehow acquired enormous stones, transported them across challenging terrain, shaped them with relatively simple tools, and raised them into carefully organized structures. The largest stones at Stonehenge are known as sarsens. These massive blocks of hard sandstone form many of the most recognizable parts of the monument. Some weigh around 20 tons, while the largest are considerably heavier. Imagine standing next to one of these stones. It is not simply a large rock. It is an enormous mass of stone rising above the height of a person, weighing roughly as much as several large elephants. And yet the builders did not simply place the stones on the ground. They raised them vertically. They created horizontal lintels and fitted them across the tops of upright stones, producing the iconic trilithon structures that make Stonehenge so recognizable. Even more remarkable, some of the stones appear to have been deliberately shaped. Their surfaces were worked. Their bases were prepared. Their tops and sides were modified to fit into a carefully planned arrangement. The builders created joints between stones, including forms that resemble primitive carpentry techniques. Instead of simply stacking rocks, they were constructing a monumental architectural system. But where did these stones come from? That question leads us even deeper into the mystery. The sarsens were not transported from a random location. Geological research has connected the majority of them to the Marlborough Downs region, roughly 20 miles north of Stonehenge. 20 miles might not sound extraordinary to a modern person. Today, you could drive that distance in less than an hour. But imagine moving a 20-ton block through a prehistoric landscape without a motorized vehicle. There were no paved roads waiting for them. There was no fleet of trucks. Every meter had to be conquered by human effort. And then there are the bluestones. These smaller stones have become one of the most intriguing parts of the Stonehenge story because many of them originated in Wales, particularly in the Prehistoric Hills of Pembrokeshire. That means the people who constructed Stonehenge were somehow transporting distinctive stones over a remarkable distance from Western Wales to southern England. Exactly how that journey happened remains an important subject of archaeological research. Think about the implications. The builders could have used stone from much closer locations. They could have chosen whatever large rocks were easiest to obtain. Instead, particular stones were selected and transported over great distances. That suggests that the stones themselves mattered. Perhaps their physical properties mattered. Perhaps their appearance mattered. Perhaps their geological origin carried cultural or spiritual meaning. Or perhaps the journey itself was part of the ritual. We do not know. And that uncertainty is one of the reasons Stonehenge remains so fascinating. For decades, researchers and experimental archaeologists have attempted to understand how prehistoric people could have moved these enormous objects. One possibility involves wooden sledges. A massive stone could have been placed on a wooden platform and dragged across prepared ground. Ropes made from plant fibers could have been used to pull the load. Wooden structures could have helped lift the stones. Other experiments have explored the use of rollers, tracks, timber frames, and different forms of leverage. These ideas demonstrate something important. The technology required may not have been as impossible as it first appears. Ancient people did not need engines to move heavy objects. They needed organization. They needed enormous amounts of labor. They needed ropes, timber, stone tools, knowledge of leverage, and above all, time. And time is perhaps the most underestimated resource in the Stonehenge story. Imagine that you are one person living in Britain 5,000 years ago. You will never see the completed monument. Your children may not see it either. Perhaps your grandchildren will inherit the work. Generation after generation, people could contribute to a project whose final form they might never witness. That changes the meaning of Stonehenge. This was not simply construction. It was a long-term cultural commitment. Thousands of people may have participated in different stages of activity across the surrounding landscape. Some would have cut timber. Others would have prepared the ground. Others would have shaped stones. Others would have transported materials. Food had to be produced. Workers had to be supported. Communities had to coordinate their efforts. A monument like Stonehenge, therefore, tells us something about the society that created it. It tells us that these people were capable of collective organization on a scale that challenges the old image of prehistoric humans as isolated and primitive. They could plan. They could coordinate. They could preserve traditions across generations. And they were willing to invest extraordinary effort into something that was not simply a shelter, a tool, or a weapon. They were building meaning into the landscape. But moving the stones was only half the problem. Getting an enormous stone to Stonehenge did not mean it was ready. The builders still had to raise it. And this is where the engineering becomes astonishing. To raise one of the massive upright stones, prehistoric workers could have excavated a deep hole and created a sloped trench beside it. The stone may have been positioned over the hole and gradually pulled upright using ropes and wooden structures. Once vertical, the base could have been secured with packed stones and earth. Then came the lintels. These horizontal stones had to be lifted onto the tops of upright pillars. Without modern cranes, this required another extraordinary engineering solution. Perhaps wooden ramps were used. Perhaps temporary platforms were constructed. Perhaps the builders raised the lintels incrementally using leverage. Perhaps several techniques were combined. Archaeologists continue to investigate these possibilities. But even if we understand the basic mechanics, something still feels extraordinary. Because Stonehenge was not built merely to prove that its builders could move rocks. There was a reason, and that reason may be hidden in the geometry of the monument itself. Stand inside Stonehenge and look carefully at the arrangement of the stones. The monument was not random. There is symmetry. There are repeated forms. There are entrances. There are carefully positioned stones. And there are alignments that appear connected to significant points in the movement of the sun. This means the builders were not simply solving an engineering problem. They were constructing a place with a purpose. And perhaps that purpose explains why they were willing to transport stones from distant landscapes and devote generations of effort to a single location. But there is another mystery. Stonehenge was not isolated. The surrounding Salisbury Plain contains a vast prehistoric landscape filled with other monuments, earthworks, burial sites, avenues, and ceremonial structures. Stonehenge appears to have been one component of something much larger. The famous stone circle may therefore be only the part we remember. Imagine what the landscape looked like when it was alive. People arriving from distant communities. Animals moving across the plains. Fires burning at night. Ceremonial gatherings. Funerals. Food. Music. Rituals. And in the center of it all, enormous stones rising against the sky. Stonehenge may have been a destination. It may have been a gathering place. It may have been a sacred landscape. Or perhaps it served several purposes at different points in its long history. That is another important lesson about ancient monuments. We often want one simple answer: temple, tomb, calendar, observatory. But Stonehenge may not fit neatly into a single category. Its meaning could have changed over time. The people who began constructing the monument may have had different beliefs from the people who modified it centuries later. One generation may have focused on burial rituals. Another may have emphasized seasonal ceremonies. Another may have viewed the monument as a place connected to ancestors, identity, or political authority. The stones remained. The people changed, and the meaning may have changed with them. Yet there is one detail that makes the story even more mysterious. The builders did not simply place the stones wherever they happened to fit. Some parts of Stonehenge appear to have been deliberately aligned with the movements of the sun, especially around the solstices. At the height of summer, the sunrise appears along a significant axis of the monument. At midwinter, the sunset aligns with another important direction. To modern eyes, this might look like an ancient calendar. But to the people who built Stonehenge, the sun may have represented far more than a way to measure time. The changing position of the sun could have marked the rhythm of the year. It could have determined agricultural cycles. It could have been connected to ceremonies. It could have represented death and rebirth. Or it could have been part of a religious worldview in which the movements of the heavens were deeply connected to the lives of humans on Earth. And suddenly, the stones begin to look different. They are no longer just massive blocks of rock. They become markers, symbols, perhaps even a form of communication between generations. The builders may have known that they would eventually die. They may have known that their homes would disappear. They may have known that their names would never be remembered, but they built something that could survive them, something that could communicate across time without using a single written word. 5,000 years later, we are still standing in front of it, still asking questions, still trying to reconstruct the thoughts of people who left almost no written record behind. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary achievement of Stonehenge. Not the weight of the stones, not the engineering, not even the astronomical alignments, but the fact that a society from a vanished world managed to leave behind a mystery powerful enough to capture the imagination of people thousands of years later. Yet one question remains unanswered. If moving these stones required such enormous effort, if constructing the monument demanded generations of labor, if distant stones were deliberately transported to this exact location, then there must have been a reason important enough to justify the impossible. And that brings us to the next mystery. Stonehenge was not simply built. It was built for something. And to understand that purpose, we have to stop looking at the stones and start looking at the sky. For thousands of years, Stonehenge has stood beneath the same sky. The stones have weathered storms, survived centuries of human conflict, and watched entire civilizations disappear. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about this ancient monument is not simply where the stones came from or how they were transported. It is the possibility that the people who built Stonehenge were trying to create something that connected the human world to something much larger, the movement of the sun, the changing seasons, the cycle of life, and perhaps even the mysterious boundary between the living and the dead. Because when we look closely at Stonehenge, the monument begins to look less like a collection of stones and more like a carefully designed sacred landscape. Imagine arriving at Stonehenge thousands of years ago. There are no tourists, no fences, no information signs explaining its history. There is only the open landscape, the smell of smoke from distant fires, the sound of footsteps on the earth, and the enormous stones rising against the horizon. As the sky begins to brighten, a thin line of sunlight appears in the distance. Slowly, the sun rises, and for a brief moment, its light moves through the carefully arranged stones. If you were standing there on the right day, you would witness something that could have felt almost supernatural. The sun, the landscape, and the monument appeared to meet at precisely the same point. This is one of the reasons Stonehenge has fascinated researchers for generations. The monument appears to have been deliberately aligned with important positions of the sun. The most famous example involves the solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year. Around the summer solstice, the rising sun aligns with the northeastern entrance of the monument and a central stone known as the heel stone. Around the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns along another important axis through the monument. To modern people, these alignments can look like an ancient astronomical instrument. But we have to be careful. Calling Stonehenge an observatory can make it sound as though prehistoric people were using it like a modern scientific facility. There is no evidence that Stonehenge functioned as an observatory in the modern sense. What we can say is that the builders appear to have paid close attention to the movements of the sun and incorporated those movements into the design of the monument. And that distinction matters, because for the people who built Stonehenge, astronomy may not have been separate from religion. Today, we divide knowledge into categories. Astronomy belongs to science. Religion belongs to spirituality. Agriculture belongs to practical life. Death belongs to funerary tradition. But ancient societies may not have seen these things as separate. The movement of the sun could have been simultaneously a physical phenomenon, a calendar, a spiritual symbol, and a foundation for communal ritual. The sun determined the rhythm of the year. It told people when the seasons were changing. It influenced agriculture. It marked the longest and shortest days. And perhaps, in the minds of the people who gathered at Stonehenge, it represented something even deeper, the eternal cycle of death and renewal. Think about the winter solstice. The days become shorter. Darkness dominates the landscape. Then, slowly, the daylight begins to return. In an agricultural society dependent on the seasons, that transition would have mattered enormously. It may have been a moment of fear, hope, celebration, or ritual. Now imagine hundreds of people gathering around the monument during the darkest period of the year. Fires burning in the cold night, food being prepared, animals nearby, drums or voices echoing across the plain. And then, at the critical moment, the setting sun disappears behind the stones. We cannot know exactly what those people believed, but we can understand why such an event could have been powerful. Stonehenge may have transformed the movement of the sun into a shared human experience. But the sun was not the only mystery surrounding this landscape. There was also death. The area around Stonehenge contains evidence of burials and funerary activity. Human remains have been discovered in the broader Stonehenge landscape, including cremated remains. This has led archaeologists to consider whether the monument and its surrounding landscape were deeply connected with death, ancestry, and ceremonial practices. And this changes the atmosphere of the story. Stonehenge is often presented as a beautiful prehistoric monument. But imagine what it may have felt like when it was actually being used. This could have been a place where people brought their dead. A place where communities gathered to remember ancestors. A place where the boundary between life and death was symbolically crossed. A place where the living came to communicate with the memory of those who had disappeared. Perhaps the enormous stones themselves represented permanence. Human beings die, generations disappear, but the stones remain. That symbolism would have been powerful. A person could live for several decades. A monument could survive for centuries. Stonehenge could therefore become a physical representation of something the ancient world understood very well: the difference between the temporary nature of human life and the apparent permanence of the landscape. And there is something else. The people who built Stonehenge did not live in isolation from the natural world. They depended on it. Their survival was connected to weather, animals, plants, water, and the changing seasons. The landscape was not simply scenery. It was life itself. That may explain why the location mattered. Stonehenge stands within an enormous prehistoric landscape containing other monuments, burial sites, earthworks, avenues, and ceremonial features. One of the most important nearby sites is Dynton Walls, a huge prehistoric enclosure located only a few miles from Stonehenge. Archaeological discoveries there have revealed evidence of substantial prehistoric activity, including houses and large quantities of animal bones. This suggests something remarkable. Stonehenge may have been part of a much larger ceremonial world. People may have lived in one area, gathered in another, traveled along ceremonial routes, and eventually reached Stonehenge itself. The landscape could have functioned almost like a giant ritual map. Imagine walking through that landscape thousands of years ago. You would not see isolated archaeological sites. You would see a connected world. Paths, monuments, burial grounds, rivers, hills, woodlands, and Stonehenge standing at the center of an extraordinary network of places. Perhaps the journey towards Stonehenge was itself important. Perhaps reaching the monument was not simply about arriving at a destination. It was about transformation. You entered one part of the landscape as an ordinary person. You traveled. You passed monuments and sacred locations. You crossed boundaries. And eventually you arrived among the stones. This possibility becomes even more interesting when we consider the relationship between Stonehenge and the nearby river Avon. The river appears to have been an important element of the prehistoric landscape. Archaeologists have identified an avenue connecting the Stonehenge area toward the river. This suggests that movement between the monument and the water may have had ceremonial significance. Water and death are powerful symbols across human cultures. Water can represent transition. A river can represent a boundary. And in many ancient belief systems, crossing water could symbolize entering another world. We cannot simply impose later religious ideas onto prehistoric Britain, but we can recognize the possibility that the people who built Stonehenge understood their landscape symbolically. And this brings us to one of the strangest questions surrounding the monument. Why were certain stones chosen? The bluestones are particularly intriguing because they came from distant Wales. Why transport those stones all the way to Stonehenge? Their geological origin suggests that the journey was intentional. One possibility is that the stones had a special symbolic meaning because of where they came from. Another possibility is that the people who brought them believed the stones possessed particular qualities. Some researchers have explored whether the bluestones may have been associated with healing traditions. There is evidence that some ancient people may have believed certain stones had special powers. But we should not turn that possibility into certainty. We do not have a written document from the builders saying, "These stones can heal." We simply have clues. And clues are what make Stonehenge so fascinating. Because the ancient builders left us almost no written explanation. No inscription. No blueprint. No manual. No ancient architect stepping forward to explain the design. Instead, they left stones. And we are forced to interpret them. This is where the mystery becomes almost philosophical. How do you reconstruct the beliefs of a civilization that left no written history? You study what they built. You examine where they buried their dead. You analyze the materials they selected. You investigate where those materials came from. You reconstruct ancient landscapes. You study the alignment of monuments. You analyze animal remains. You examine human remains. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture begins to emerge. But it is never complete. There are always missing pieces. And those missing pieces have created some of the most extraordinary theories about Stonehenge. Some people have argued that the monument was primarily an astronomical calendar. Others have suggested it was a temple. Others believe it was connected to healing. Others emphasize its role in funerary rituals and ancestor worship. Some see it as a place where distant communities came together. And perhaps the answer is not one of these. Perhaps Stonehenge was all of them. A place where astronomy, ritual, politics, death, identity, and community came together. That possibility makes the monument even more impressive. Because Stonehenge may have been designed not for one purpose, but for an entire worldview. A worldview in which the sun, the seasons, the ancestors, the land, and the living community were connected. And if that is true, then the geometry of Stonehenge was more than engineering. It was symbolism. The stones marked directions. The openings framed the sky. The movement of the sun gave meaning to particular moments of the year. The surrounding landscape created pathways and boundaries. The monument may have turned the natural world into a kind of sacred architecture. But there is one final mystery that makes the story even stranger. Why did people keep coming back? Stonehenge was not built overnight. Different generations returned to the site and modified it. That means the monument retained meaning across enormous spans of time. Think about that. A person could have worked on Stonehenge and died without seeing its final form. Then their descendants could continue the work. Generation after generation, century after century, the monument became a bridge between people who would never meet. That may be one of the most profound aspects of Stonehenge. It was not just a structure, it was a tradition. And traditions can survive even when the original reason for them begins to change. Perhaps the people who started the monument had one vision. Hundreds of years later, another generation interpreted it differently. But they continued, because the stones had become part of their identity, part of their memory, part of their understanding of the world. And perhaps that is why Stonehenge survived. Not because the builders knew exactly how future generations would understand it, but because they created something powerful enough to keep people coming back. Still, there is another side to the Stonehenge mystery. Whenever history leaves a blank space, human imagination rushes in to fill it. For centuries, people created stories to explain these impossible stones. Stories of giants, stories of magic, stories of ancient kings, and eventually, in the modern era, theories of visitors from the stars. But are these stories telling us something about Stonehenge, or are they telling us something about ourselves? Because when a mystery survives for thousands of years, every generation wants to solve it in its own way. And that brings us to the final chapter of our journey, a world of ancient legends, lost knowledge, extraordinary theories, and one question that refuses to disappear. If the builders of Stonehenge understood the monument's true purpose, what did they know that we have forgotten? For more than 5,000 years, Stonehenge has stood beneath the changing sky of southern Britain. Generations have come and disappeared. Kingdoms have risen and collapsed. Languages have vanished. Religions have transformed. Yet the stones remain. And whenever humanity encounters something ancient that seems impossible to explain, one instinct appears again and again. We create a story. Long before modern archaeology attempted to reconstruct the truth of Stonehenge, people had already created explanations for its existence. Some believe giants had built it. Others connected it to magic and legendary kings. Later, the monument became associated with Merlin, the mythical wizard of Arthurian legend. And in the modern age, another extraordinary possibility appeared, the idea that perhaps the builders of Stonehenge were not entirely human. But behind all these stories lies a much deeper question. What happens when a civilization leaves behind a monument, but not the instructions for understanding it? To medieval Europeans, Stonehenge was already ancient beyond imagination. Its original builders had disappeared thousands of years earlier, leaving no written explanation behind. Medieval writers encountered the stones much as we do today, as an enormous mystery standing on an open plain. One of the most famous legends eventually connected Stonehenge to the wizard Merlin. According to the medieval tradition recorded by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the stones had been brought from Ireland by giants and transported through the magical power of Merlin. The story is not historical evidence. It belongs to the world of legend, but it reveals something important about how people have always responded to Stonehenge. When ordinary explanations seemed inadequate, supernatural ones filled the gap. And perhaps we should not be surprised. Imagine living centuries ago and seeing Stonehenge without knowing about archaeology, geology, engineering, or prehistoric Britain. You see enormous stones standing in a carefully arranged circle. Some are taller than people. Some weigh many tons. They have been transported from distant locations. They are aligned with the landscape and the sky. And there is no obvious explanation for why anyone would undertake such an enormous project. The natural conclusion might not be a prehistoric society organized generations of labor using sophisticated engineering. The natural conclusion might be giants did this, or magic, or gods, or some lost civilization. Stonehenge became a mirror for the imagination. But then science began asking a different kind of question. Not, what legend explains Stonehenge, but what physical evidence can we recover? And that shift changed everything. Archaeology began to reveal that Stonehenge was not a mysterious object that appeared out of nowhere. It was part of a complex prehistoric society. Its construction occurred over long periods. The surrounding landscape contained other monuments and evidence of human activity. The stones had geological origins that could be investigated. Human remains could be studied. Ancient tools could be analyzed. Soil could be examined. Even microscopic traces could reveal information about the environment thousands of years ago. The mystery did not disappear. It became more sophisticated. We began to understand how some parts of Stonehenge may have been built. We began to understand where many of the stones came from. We began to understand that the monument had connections to seasonal solar movements. We began to understand that the surrounding landscape had enormous ceremonial importance. But every answer seemed to create another question. And this is where the idea of lost knowledge becomes fascinating. When people hear the phrase lost knowledge, they sometimes imagine an ancient civilization possessing technology equivalent to ours and then somehow losing it. There is no evidence that Stonehenge represents some forgotten industrial technology or advanced civilization comparable to the modern world. But there is another, much more realistic meaning of lost knowledge. Knowledge can disappear without leaving a written record. A technique can vanish. A ritual can disappear. A tradition can be forgotten. A language can become extinct. A cultural meaning can disappear even while the physical monument survives. Imagine a group of builders teaching their children how to construct a particular stone structure. Those children teach the next generation. Eventually, the tradition changes. Perhaps the original ritual is modified. Perhaps the original explanation is forgotten. But the monument remains. That may be exactly what happened at Stonehenge. The stones survived. The meaning may not have. And that is a much more haunting possibility than the idea of a lost machine. Because it means the most important information about Stonehenge may have vanished with the people who understood it. Think about our own world. If someone found an enormous stadium thousands of years from now but had no written records of modern sports, would they know exactly what happened there? They might discover seats. They might discover entrances. They might find traces of food. They might reconstruct the architecture. They might even understand that large groups of people gathered there. But would they know why people screamed? Why they wore certain colors? Why they celebrated? Why the result of a game mattered so much? Probably not. The physical structure would survive. The cultural meaning might not. Stonehenge could present exactly this problem on an incomparably larger scale. We can study the stones, but we cannot interview the people who stood beside them. We can reconstruct the landscape, but we cannot hear the songs that once echoed across it. We can study the graves, but we cannot know exactly what the mourners believed. We can calculate solar alignments, but we cannot know what those alignments meant inside the minds of the people who built them. And perhaps this is why the monument continues to attract theories that move far beyond conventional archaeology. One of the most famous modern theories is the ancient astronaut hypothesis. The basic argument is simple. Some people believe that prehistoric humans could not have accomplished extraordinary construction projects without assistance from an advanced civilization from somewhere beyond Earth. Stonehenge is frequently included in these discussions. The enormous stones, the astronomical alignments, the unexplained cultural context, the engineering challenge. Put these elements together, and it becomes tempting to ask, could someone else have helped? Perhaps visitors from another world. Perhaps a technologically advanced civilization that existed long before recorded history. Perhaps something that later became mythology. It is an irresistible story, but there is an important problem. There is no credible archaeological or scientific evidence demonstrating that extraterrestrials built Stonehenge or provided its builders with advanced technology. The archaeological evidence we do have points toward prehistoric human communities with increasingly sophisticated social organization, engineering skills, ritual traditions, and knowledge of their environment. In other words, we do not need aliens to make Stonehenge impressive. Humans were capable of extraordinary things. And perhaps that is the mystery we have underestimated. For a long time, popular culture portrayed prehistoric people as primitive individuals struggling simply to survive. But Stonehenge challenges that image. Its construction required planning. It required cooperation. It required knowledge of materials. It required transportation. It required engineering. It required a shared cultural purpose strong enough to motivate people over generations. That tells us something profound. Human intelligence did not suddenly appear with modern technology. The human ability to organize, imagine, build, calculate, and create meaning is ancient. The tools changed, the societies changed, but the fundamental human capacity remained. And perhaps Stonehenge is one of the clearest monuments to that capacity. Yet there is another possibility. Maybe the builders did not know everything we imagine they knew. Maybe they did not need a precise scientific theory of astronomy to align stones with the sun. They may simply have observed. For generations, year after year, they watched where the sun rose. They watched where it disappeared. They noticed the seasons. They remembered patterns. They passed observations from parent to child. And eventually, those observations became architecture. This is an important distinction. Ancient knowledge does not have to look like modern science to be sophisticated. A farmer does not need a physics textbook to understand when a season is changing. A navigator does not need modern astronomy software to recognize the stars. A builder does not need a university degree in structural engineering to understand leverage. Human beings can accumulate enormous practical knowledge through observation, experimentation, memory, and tradition. Stonehenge may be the physical expression of thousands of years of that accumulated experience. But if the monument was connected to the sky, the seasons, and the dead, then perhaps it also served another purpose. Perhaps it helped people understand their place in the universe. That may sound abstract to us, but for ancient societies, it could have been central to life. Today, many people wake up to alarms, check phones, look at clocks, and follow digital calendars. Our relationship with time is largely invisible. For prehistoric communities, time was written across the landscape and the sky. Sunrise, sunset, summer, winter, birth, death, harvest, darkness, light. The cycle repeated. Stonehenge may have helped transform those cycles into a permanent monument, a physical reminder that the universe followed patterns. And perhaps those patterns gave people a sense of order in a world they could not control. There is also something deeply human about building for people you will never meet. Imagine the first generation of builders. They begin the work. They place stones. They shape the earth. They create structures. They know that they will die, but the project continues. Their children continue it, then their grandchildren, and eventually, thousands of years later, strangers from another civilization stand among the stones and try to understand them. That is an extraordinary form of communication, not through writing, not through language, but through architecture. The builders of Stonehenge may have spoken to the future without ever knowing who would listen. And perhaps that is why the monument feels so strangely powerful. Because when we stand there, we are looking at something created by people who knew they would not live forever. They built against time, and time lost, but there is still one final mystery. If Stonehenge was so important, why did its builders eventually stop? Why did the construction and modification of the monument change? Why did the people who once gathered there eventually move on? Was the meaning lost? Did society change? Did religious beliefs transform? Did political power shift elsewhere? Did the landscape itself become less important? We can investigate these possibilities, but we cannot recover a single definitive answer. Eventually, Stonehenge became what it is today, a monument from a vanished world. And yet, it never truly disappeared. Centuries later, medieval writers created legends around it. Later generations studied it. Antiquarians measured it. Archaeologists excavated its surroundings. Scientists analyzed the stones. Tourists traveled thousands of miles to see it. And filmmakers continue to point cameras toward it whenever humanity wants to tell a story about the ancient past. Stonehenge has survived because it occupies a unique position between knowledge and mystery. We know a great deal about it, but we do not know enough. We know that humans built it, but we cannot hear their voices. We know that stones came from distant regions, but we cannot be certain of every step of their journey. We know that the monument has important solar alignments, but we cannot know exactly what those alignments meant to the people who created them. We know the surrounding landscape was connected to ritual and burial, but we cannot reconstruct the beliefs of every person who came there. And that gap between what we know and what we cannot know is where the mystery lives. Perhaps one day, new archaeological discoveries will reveal another piece of the puzzle. Perhaps a forgotten structure will be discovered beneath the soil. Perhaps new scientific techniques will tell us more about the people who built the monument. Perhaps ancient DNA will reveal connections between communities separated by enormous distances. Perhaps new discoveries will change our understanding completely. Or perhaps some questions will remain unanswered forever. And maybe that is not a failure. Maybe that is part of what makes Stonehenge extraordinary. Because not every mystery needs to end with a perfect answer. Sometimes the mystery itself becomes the legacy. 5,000 years ago, people placed enormous stones on this landscape. They did not leave behind a book explaining their purpose. They did not leave behind a recording. They did not leave behind a message written in a language we can read. They left the stones, and the stones have outlived them. They have watched the sun rise and set more times than any human could count. They have witnessed generations disappear. They have survived changes in climate, culture, religion, and empire. And they are still standing, silent, ancient, patient. Perhaps Stonehenge was a temple. Perhaps it was a ceremonial center. Perhaps it was a place for the dead. Perhaps it was connected to the sun and the changing seasons. Perhaps it served several purposes across different periods. And perhaps somewhere between all of these possibilities lies the truth. But there is one conclusion we can make with confidence. The people who built Stonehenge were not simply primitive people stacking rocks. They were humans capable of extraordinary cooperation, observation, engineering, imagination, and belief. They looked at the same sky we look at today. They watched the same sunrise. They experienced the same changing seasons. They loved. They mourned. They feared death. They searched for meaning. And they built something that would allow their existence to echo across thousands of years. Today, we stand in front of those stones and ask what they meant. But perhaps we should ask a different question. What does Stonehenge mean to us? Because every generation sees something different in those ancient stones. To one generation, they were the work of giants. To another, the work of magic. To modern science, they are evidence of a sophisticated prehistoric society. To some, they remain a mystery connected to the stars. But perhaps the most remarkable explanation is also the simplest. Stonehenge was built by human beings who wanted to create something that mattered. Something larger than themselves. Something that could survive their own lives. And they succeeded. More than 5,000 years later, we are still talking about them. Still searching for their meaning. Still standing beneath their stones, still looking toward the sky, and still asking the question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Why did they build Stonehenge? Maybe someday we will finally discover the answer. But until that day comes, the stones will remain exactly where they have always been, watching the sun, watching the seasons, watching humanity change, and keeping their oldest secret buried beneath the ancient earth. Stonehenge does not speak, simply waits, and perhaps that is what makes its mystery impossible to forget. Tonight, we began with a simple question: who built Stonehenge? And why? After more than 5,000 years, we have discovered pieces of the answer. We know that prehistoric people built the monument. We know that some of its stones traveled extraordinary distances. We know that its construction required planning, cooperation, engineering, and generations of human effort. We know that the monument was connected to a much larger prehistoric landscape. And we know that the movement of the sun appears to have played an important role in its design. But the most important question remains unanswered. What did Stonehenge mean to the people who stood among these stones when they were new? Perhaps it was a sacred place. Perhaps it was connected to the dead. Perhaps it marked the changing seasons. Perhaps it was a place where communities gathered to celebrate, mourn, remember, and search for meaning. Or perhaps its purpose changed over hundreds of years, as one generation inherited the stones from another. We may never know for certain, and maybe that is the most fascinating part of the story, because Stonehenge has survived without telling us exactly what it means. It has survived without a written explanation, without a blueprint, without a final message. Its builders disappeared thousands of years ago. Their homes disappeared. Their voices disappeared. Their beliefs became fragments. But the stones remained. Every morning, the sun rises over the same ancient landscape. Every winter, the days become shorter. Every summer, the light returns. And the stones continue to stand exactly where prehistoric hands placed them. Think about that. The people who built Stonehenge could never have imagined our world. They could not have imagined airplanes crossing the sky. They could not have imagined cities filled with millions of people. They could not have imagined cameras, computers, satellites, or spacecraft. Yet somehow, they created something that would eventually become part of our world. Something that would make people thousands of years later stop, look, and wonder. Perhaps that was their greatest achievement. Not simply moving enormous stones, not simply understanding the movement of the sun, but creating something capable of surviving time itself. Stonehenge reminds us that civilizations disappear, names disappear, languages disappear. Even the greatest achievements of one generation can become mysteries to another. But what humans create can sometimes outlive what humans remember. And so, after 5,000 years, Stonehenge remains. Not as a complete answer, but as an invitation to keep asking questions. Maybe one day, archaeology will uncover another piece of the puzzle. Maybe technology will reveal secrets hidden beneath the landscape. Maybe we will finally understand why those distant stones were chosen. Or perhaps some mysteries are destined to remain mysteries. Perhaps the people who built Stonehenge left one final lesson behind: that human beings do not need to know everything to create something extraordinary. They simply need to look at the world, wonder, and decide that something is worth building. 5,000 years later, we are still here, still looking at their stones, still following the path of the sun, still searching for the meaning behind their work. And as the final light of the day disappears across Salisbury Plain, Stonehenge becomes silent once again. The visitors leave. The landscape grows dark. The wind moves through the grass. And above the ancient stones, the stars begin to appear. The same stars that prehistoric builders once watched. The same sky beneath which they lived, dreamed, feared, loved, and died. Perhaps they were trying to understand the universe. Perhaps they were trying to communicate with their ancestors. Perhaps they were trying to understand death. Or perhaps they simply wanted to leave something behind. Whatever the truth may be, they succeeded. Because 5,000 years later, their voices may be gone, but their question is still standing. Who were they? What did they know? And why did they build Stonehenge? We may never know the complete answer, but perhaps that is exactly why we keep coming back. Because Stonehenge does not give us the past. It gives us a mystery. And as long as those ancient stones continue to stand beneath the sky, the mystery will never truly disappear. Stonehenge remains silent, ancient, unexplained, and waiting for us to ask the question again.